A 20-ton excavator is tearing into my backyard right now, digging a massive pond without one call, one notice, or a shred of permission. The steel bucket rips through my grandfather's vegetable garden, the soil he worked for 40 years, where I picked tomatoes every summer as a kid. Now it's a smoking crater, black diesel fumes choking the morning air, erasing family memories scoop by brutal scoop. Directing the destruction? Brenda Kensington, our HOA president, strutting in a hard hat like she owns my deed. She's pointing deeper, already eyeing my grandfather's hand-planted oak tree for the next hit. This so-called community retention pond is slamming straight through my private property. No permits, no vote, no legal right. Just Brenda deciding my inherited land belongs to the HOA. She's about to find out how wrong she is. What's the most outrageous thing your HOA has ever pulled on your property? Drop your city/state and your worst story in the comments. Let's expose these power trips together. My name's Grant. But let me back up, because you need to understand exactly who Brenda Kensington is and why this excavator isn't her first act of suburban terrorism. 3 years ago, I inherited my grandfather's house in Willowbrook Estates, 2 acres of paradise outside Denver, where the biggest drama used to be Mrs. Smith's sunflower competition. Along with the crystal-clear deed and my grandfather's 40-year legacy, I also inherited membership in what I thought was a normal HOA. Then Brenda moved in. Fresh from some corporate hellscape in California, she slithered into our quiet neighborhood like a snake in a garden center. Within 6 months, she'd politicked her way into the HOA presidency and declared war on anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. The woman operates like a predator, always standing too close during conversations, voice pitched just loud enough to establish dominance, treating every interaction like a chess match where you don't know you're already 3 moves behind. Her declaration of war came on a Tuesday morning in October, the day she ordered me to remove my grandfather's memorial rose garden. I was deadheading the last blooms of the season, the same roses my grandfather had planted the year my grandmother died, when Brenda appeared at my fence line wearing her signature fake smile and clutching a violation notice like a weapon. "Grant, those roses are creating a sightline obstruction," she announced, pointing at the memorial plaque my grandfather had installed among the bushes. Community safety requires clear visibility between properties. The roses barely reached my waist. A toddler could see over them. "These are memorial roses," I told her, my voice tight with disbelief. "They commemorate my grandmother. I understand your emotional attachment, but HOA covenants don't make exceptions for sentiment." She handed me the citation with theatrical sympathy. "You have 14 days to achieve compliance or face escalating fines." The paper felt toxic in my hands, officially demanding I destroy the last living connection to my grandparents' 60-year love story because Brenda decided visibility mattered more than memory. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a bureaucrat. I was dealing with someone who got genuine pleasure from destroying what other people treasured. But the rose garden was just her opening move. Over the next year, she launched systematic attacks disguised as community improvement, violation notices for my grandfather's vegetable garden, too visible from the street, citations for his hand-planted oak tree, potential property damage risk, demands that I repaint my mailbox because it was 3 inches beyond approved setback parameters. In Colorado, HOA violations must be based on actual covenant violations, not personal preferences. If the rule doesn't exist in writing, the citation is legally meaningless, but they're counting on you not knowing that. Always demand the specific written rule being violated. The pattern became crystal clear after documenting other properties. The Hendersons had gardens 3 times larger than mine. No violations. Bob Martinez's oak tree literally hung over his neighbor's roof, ignored completely. The Patels painted their mailbox powder blue, never cited once. Every single violation targeted the same people. Me, the Washingtons, our only black family, old Mr. Kowalski with his thick accent, and the young Garcia family. Brenda wasn't just power drunk. She was running ethnic cleansing through paperwork. The final proof came when she cited the Washingtons for excessive Christmas decorations in July, 6 months after their lights came down. When Janet Washington showed me the violation notice, I could smell the malice radiating off the paper like cheap perfume. That's when I transformed my dining room into a war room, documenting every discriminatory pattern, every bogus citation, every act of harassment disguised as community governance. I built a federal fair housing case that would make prosecutors weep with joy. But I never thought she'd escalate from memorial garden destruction to actual property theft. I figured she'd stick to paper terrorism, bureaucratic intimidation, designed to exhaust people into submission. I thought even Brenda understood there were lines you don't cross. Wrong. Dead wrong. Now she's got a 20-ton excavator systematically destroying my grandfather's legacy while wearing a hard hat like she's the queen of my property. She just graduated from harassment to felony destruction. Time to show her what happens when you declare war on the wrong homeowner's family history. The pond incident started innocently enough, or so I thought. March 15th, a Tuesday that began like any other, until my neighbor Janet called at 7 a.m. with panic cracking her voice. "Grant, you need to get outside right now. There's heavy equipment in your backyard." I threw on clothes and ran outside to find a scene that looked like battlefield preparation. A massive John Deere excavator was methodically destroying my back fence, its steel bucket taking house-sized bites out of the ground, where my tomatoes had grown for 3 seasons. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the rich scent of torn earth, creating this nauseating cloud that burned my throat and made my eyes water. Standing behind the machine, wearing a hard hat like she was overseeing the Panama Canal project, was Brenda. She had her signature clipboard, naturally, and was directing the operator with the kind of precise hand gestures that belonged in an airport control tower. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" I shouted over the engine noise. She turned with this practiced look of surprise, like she'd been rehearsing this moment in her bathroom mirror. "Oh, Grant, good morning. This is the emergency drainage project. Didn't you get the notice?" The notice. Of course there was supposed to be a notice that mysteriously never arrived. What notice? And since when do HOA projects happen on private property without permission? Brenda's smile could have flash-frozen boiling water. Section 12. 3B of the Covenants grants the HOA emergency powers for infrastructure projects that benefit community safety. This retention pond will prevent flooding in the lower lots during heavy rains. The metallic grinding of the excavator's tracks against my grandfather's hand-laid flagstone path made my teeth ache. 40 years of careful stonework was being pulverized under 20 tons of steel, while this woman quoted fake legal authority like she was reading from scripture. The operator, a weathered guy in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, kept glancing between us with the expression of someone watching a bar fight he wanted no part of. "Show me the emergency authorization," I demanded, pulling out my phone to start recording everything. "It's all filed properly with the city," she replied, tapping her clipboard with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on anything. "You can review the paperwork during normal business hours." That's when the pieces clicked into place. I dealt with real emergency authorizations during my first year of fighting Brenda's harassment campaign. When she tried to have my oak tree emergency removed after a minor thunderstorm, I learned that legitimate emergency work requires immediate notification to affected property owners. The city doesn't just let people dig up private property based on clipboard authority and a hard hat. The crunch of destroyed gravel under my boots provided percussion to her increasingly defensive explanations as I documented every angle of the destruction. "Grant, you're being unnecessarily confrontational about a project that benefits the entire community. Everyone except the guy whose family legacy you're feeding into a wood chipper." Within 2 hours, I'd assembled my response team. The police classified it as a civil matter, but the city planning department perked up immediately when I mentioned unauthorized excavation permits. My lawyer friend Derek, who specialized in property disputes and had a particular hatred for bureaucratic bullies, promised to pull permit records within the hour. Derek's callback made my entire week. "I've got the permit application right here on my screen. Your friend Brenda listed herself as the property owner for your lot. She literally filed paperwork with the city claiming she owns your land." The woman had just graduated from petty harassment to federal fraud territory. I'd read enough about permit violations during my documentation phase to know that filing false ownership claims wasn't just stupid, it was criminally stupid. The kind of stupid that carries felony charges and mandatory prison time. But the real satisfaction came when City Inspector Patricia Reeves arrived the next morning with her own clipboard and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that makes fake authorities everywhere break into cold sweats. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Brenda with professional courtesy that barely concealed complete contempt, "this permit application contains several material misstatements. Most notably, you don't own this property." Brenda's face cycled through more emotions than a soap opera actress discovering her evil twin. "That's obviously a clerical error. Filing false permit applications is a Class 4 felony under Colorado law," Inspector Reeves interrupted, consulting her tablet with the precision of a surgeon. "It carries up to 6 years in prison and $500,000 in fines. We prosecute these cases aggressively because fraudulent permits undermine public safety." The excavator went silent so abruptly that birds started chirping in the sudden quiet. The operator was loading his machine onto the trailer before Brenda could form a coherent response, clearly wanting zero involvement in whatever legal disaster was unfolding. "You have 24 hours to cease all excavation activities and file corrected paperwork," Inspector Reeves continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. "Any continued work without proper authorization results in immediate criminal charges." Victory tasted like diesel fumes, and justice served with heavy machinery. But if I thought exposing Brenda's criminal fraud would end this war, I seriously underestimated her capacity for suburban vengeance. This woman didn't retreat when caught red-handed. She doubled down. And her next move would be masterfully, breathtakingly petty. You'd think getting caught filing fraudulent permits might humble someone. You'd think wrong. Brenda's retaliation came exactly 1 week later, and it was absolutely vicious. I was drinking my morning coffee, still staring at the excavator damage through my kitchen window, when the certified letter arrived. Another thick envelope, another performance of fake authority, but this time, Brenda had crafted something truly diabolical. The violation notice accused me of willful destruction of HOA infrastructure and interference with community improvement projects. According to her twisted version of reality, my aggressive confrontation with the pond crew had caused costly delays and equipment damage that I was now personally liable for. But the real gut punch came on page 3, a photocopied plat map from 1962 showing a perpetual drainage easement slicing directly through my backyard. The document looked completely legitimate, aged paper with authentic coffee stains, official county stamps, surveyor signatures from before Kennedy was president. According to this map, the Homeowners Association had permanent rights to install drainage infrastructure on my property, dating back 60 years before I even existed. I traced that easement boundary with my finger, and it covered exactly where Brenda had started digging. Perfect alignment, surgical precision, too convenient to be anything but planned. This woman had outmaneuvered me with homework that would impress law professors. My hands were shaking when I called Derek. "She's got documentation going back to 1962. Legal easement rights that predate my ownership by decades." "Slow down," Derek said, and I could hear him typing furiously. "Real easements don't vanish from property records without leaving traces. Something about this timing stinks like week-old fish." The surveyor Derek recommended, Tom Berkshire, showed up 2 days later with equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie. Laser measuring devices that beeped like medical monitors, GPS units precise enough to locate individual blades of grass, tools that hummed electronic symphonies as he mapped every inch of my property. The morning air carried that sharp bite of early spring, and frost still sparkled on the torn earth where heavy machinery had ripped through my grandfather's careful landscaping. Tom's measuring tape sang its metallic song as he stretched it across the destruction, calling out coordinates with mathematical poetry. "Easements documented on the original plat, all right," he confirmed after 3 hours of measurements that would satisfy NASA engineers. But something's off about the legal description. He pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the document with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. The morning sun caught the glass lens, throwing tiny rainbows across the aged paper as he searched for details invisible to normal vision. "Here's what she didn't expect anyone to find," Tom said, pointing to microscopic text in the document's corner. "This easement was officially abandoned in 1987. See this county clerk notation? Abandoned by non-use with the official seal. My legal research from fighting Brenda's earlier harassment campaigns kicked in like muscle memory. Abandoned easements die completely. They revert to the property owner and can't be resurrected without starting the entire approval process from scratch. If this easement was legally dead in 1987, Brenda had zero authority to dig so much as a flower bed on my land. The counterattack wrote itself. I drafted a demand letter requiring the HOA to pay complete restoration costs under abandoned easement law, citing precedents that would bankrupt their operating budget if they tried to fight it. But something nagged at me. The document was too perfect, too conveniently aligned with Brenda's pond project. So I started digging through HOA financial records, which Colorado law makes available to any homeowner patient enough to navigate the bureaucratic maze. Those boring spreadsheets revealed a pattern that made my earlier anger look like gentle annoyance. 18 months of payments to a downtown Denver law firm, $3,200 in legal research expenses. Every invoice focused on easement research and documentation for multiple properties throughout Willowbrook Estates. Brenda wasn't just targeting me, she was building legal weapons against half the neighborhood. Then I found the smoking gun that stopped my heart. February invoice, $847 for historical document reproduction and aging services. She'd hired professionals to create fake vintage documents. When I called the law firm pretending to need similar services, the receptionist cheerfully explained their specialty in property documentation services and historical legal research support. They'd helped Brenda manufacture authentic-looking legal documents, aging them with chemicals and techniques that fooled county records clerks. Brenda had committed systematic fraud, using HOA funds to create fake legal justification for stealing residents' property rights. The woman had turned our neighborhood association into a criminal enterprise disguised as suburban governance. Every piece of evidence was documented, photographed, and legally bulletproof. Financial fraud, document forgery, abuse of authority, systematic harassment. I had enough criminal evidence to send Brenda to federal prison and bankrupt her personally. The trap was set with precision that would make Swiss watchmakers jealous. Time to spring it in front of the entire neighborhood and end her criminal career permanently. Brenda's third escalation proved she'd crossed the line from harassment into full-blown delusion. The anonymous complaint arrived on a Thursday that started with sunshine and ended in bureaucratic hell. Code Enforcement Officer Julie Martinez appeared at my door looking like she'd rather be investigating actual crimes instead of neighborhood drama. "Mr. Thompson, we received a report that you're operating an unlicensed commercial landscaping business from your residence." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard since Brenda claimed my tomatoes were a safety hazard." Anonymous complaint filed yesterday alleges you're storing commercial equipment, accepting payments for landscaping services, and operating without proper permits. She tapped her tablet with the weary rhythm of someone who'd mediated too many petty feuds. "I'm required to inspect for code violations." The complaint read like a paranoid conspiracy theory. Specific ordinances cited with legal precision, detailed inventory of my commercial-grade garden tools, aerial photographs of my tool shed that must have been taken from a drone or neighbor's second-story window. Someone had invested serious surveillance time in crafting this fiction. Officer Martinez spent an hour documenting my entirely normal collection of shovels, rakes, and a lawnmower that probably remembered the Clinton presidency. The bitter smell of her government-issued coffee mixed with morning air as she photographed everything that proved the complaint was elaborate fantasy. Whoever filed this has either never seen actual commercial operations, or they're deliberately wasting city resources, she concluded, snapping her tablet shut. Your property shows zero evidence of business activity, but the precision bothered me. The complaint felt too targeted, too carefully engineered to maximize bureaucratic inconvenience without crossing into obvious fraud. It had Brenda's fingerprints all over it, if I could prove it. A favor that might involve bending some rules. His expression shifted from friendly neighbor to professional concern. How bent are we talking? I need to know who filed that fake complaint against me, hypothetically. Bob's pause lasted long enough for me to hear crickets chirping in his backyard. Hypothetically, online complaints create digital trails, and hypothetically, Robert Hutchinson, at the address listed, doesn't exist in any county database, but the computer signature traces to an IP address registered to someone whose name rhymes with Brenda. She'd committed digital fraud using a fictional identity from her own home internet connection. The woman had either completely lost her mind or become so confident in her fake authority that she'd stopped caring about evidence trails. My response required maximum community exposure with theatrical impact. I spent the weekend crafting the neighborhood newsletter that would end Brenda's criminal career. Every fraudulent document photographed in high resolution, every financial violation documented with bank records, every harassment pattern laid out like a federal prosecutor's evidence board. But instead of quietly distributing it, I planned something that would guarantee every resident saw the evidence personally. Hey neighbors, community potluck this Tuesday. Let's share food and discuss some interesting discoveries about recent HOA activities. Bring your appetite and any questions about neighborhood governance. 23 families packed our community center that Tuesday evening, creating the kind of crowd density that made fire marshals nervous. The air vibrated with anticipation, while competing casserole aromas created this surreal backdrop for what everyone suspected would be a neighborhood reckoning. My evidence display covered 3 folding tables, like a crime scene investigation. Poster boards showing permit fraud, blown-up fake easement documents, financial records proving fund misuse. The whole arrangement looked like something from a courtroom drama, except our defendant was the woman who'd been terrorizing us for years. The real devastation began when neighbors started sharing their own nightmare stories. Janet Washington stood up clutching a folder that bulged with violation notices. Christmas lights citation in July. The decorations had been stored in my basement since New Year's Day, but Brenda swore she had current photographs. Miguel Garcia's voice shook with barely contained rage. Monthly fines for our constantly barking dog. We don't own a dog, haven't owned a dog. My wife's allergic to dogs, but somehow our non-existent dog violates quiet hours every week. Old Mr. Kowalski shuffled forward with a shoebox overflowing with lawn citations, his accent thick with years of accumulated frustration. She brings measuring stick to my grass every week. Same grass I cut perfect, but her stick always shows different numbers. Magic stick, always wrong numbers. By evening's end, 17 families had signed formal complaints, and 3 neighbors volunteered to provide sworn testimony about systematic harassment that crossed every legal line between community governance and criminal fraud. Brenda's retaliation came with lightning speed. The next morning brought a police report claiming I'd physically threatened her during a routine property inspection. Her creative writing described my aggressive approach and implied threats of serious consequences during what she called legitimate HOA business. But when Sergeant Williams asked for specifics, her story crumbled faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time she'd have no escape route. The game-changing discovery came from the most unlikely source, Brenda's own arrogance. Derek called me at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, his voice tight with the kind of controlled excitement that comes from finding evidence that ends careers and starts criminal investigations. "I've been digging through the original neighborhood covenants all night," he said, barely containing what sounded like professional euphoria mixed with disbelief. Brenda just made the biggest legal mistake of her life, and she documented every second of it. I stumbled toward my coffee maker, my brain still processing the previous day's potluck revelations and the growing pile of evidence against our neighborhood's self-appointed dictator. What kind of mistake? The kind that transforms 3 years of harassment into federal fraud charges with mandatory prison sentences. The explanation hit me like ice water in the face. When Willowbrook Estates was developed in 1978, residents operated under voluntary guidelines. Suggestions about lawn care and house colors, nothing more. The mandatory HOA with enforcement powers didn't exist until 1985, when enough homeowners voted to establish binding covenants with legal teeth. But here's what Brenda either didn't know or chose to ignore. Properties purchased before 1985 were grandfathered under the old voluntary system. Unless owners specifically opted into the new mandatory structure through written agreement, they remained exempt from HOA authority. Brenda bought her house in March 1984, Derek continued, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for delivering devastating news. She's been claiming HOA powers while legally having no more authority over this neighborhood than a random person walking their dog. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering against my kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic shards that somehow perfectly matched the sound of my 3-year nightmare collapsing into clarity. Every violation notice she'd sent was criminal harassment disguised as official business. Every fine she'd imposed was attempted extortion. Every board meeting she'd chaired was fraud. The pond excavation wasn't just trespassing. It was felony property destruction, committed by someone with zero legal authority to make decisions about community, anything. She's been running a completely fake presidency? My voice came out as a croak. Worse. She's been systematically committing crimes while pretending to have authority that never existed, and her own obsessive documentation proves every single violation of law. The beautiful, devastating irony was that Brenda's compulsive record-keeping had created a perfect evidence trail of her own criminal conspiracy. Every citation meticulously filed with the city, every board decision recorded in official minutes, every harassment campaign documented with the thoroughness of someone who believed her imaginary authority was unquestionable and permanent. I walked to my back window, staring at the excavator damage that had started this war, but now seeing it through completely different eyes. That wasn't HOA overreach or bureaucratic abuse. That was criminal destruction of private property by someone who had no more legal right to dig on my land than a random burglar. Derek, what's her legal exposure looking like? Criminal trespassing, felony property destruction, filing fraudulent government documents, harassment under false authority, conspiracy to commit fraud, misuse of organizational funds. His voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor laying out an unbeatable case. We're talking decades in federal prison, plus complete financial liability with no organizational protection because she was never legally authorized to act on the HOA's behalf. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with morning air coming through my open window, creating this strange sensory backdrop to the moment when 3 years of systematic torture transformed into the setup for perfect justice. Brenda had spent years wielding fake authority to destroy lives, terrorize families, and steal property rights from anyone who didn't submit to her suburban fascism. Now she was just a private citizen who'd committed enough federal crimes to disappear into the prison system until her retirement age. But destroying her wasn't enough. I wanted complete vindication, total restitution, and a public reckoning that would guarantee no other neighborhood tyrant could follow her playbook. Time to plan the most satisfying legal trap in Colorado HOA history. The perfect trap requires 3 things: overwhelming evidence, public witnesses, and the kind of poetic justice that makes people remember your story forever. My dining room had become a war room, every wall covered with evidence boards that would make federal prosecutors weep with envy. 3 years of Brenda's documented crimes spread across poster boards like a museum exhibit of suburban fascism, each violation photographed, dated, and cross-referenced with legal statutes she'd unknowingly broken. "We need to do this right," I told Derek during our strategy session, surrounded by the paper trail of Brenda's systematic fraud. Public exposure, legal witnesses, and complete restoration of my property, all happening simultaneously so she can't escape or deny anything. You want to orchestrate a public humiliation? I want to orchestrate justice with an audience. The first piece was heavy machinery. My property needed complete restoration, and I wanted that restoration to happen in front of everyone who'd watched Brenda destroy it. Tom Berkshire connected me with his brother-in-law, Ray, an excavation contractor whose weathered hands and no-nonsense attitude suggested he'd dealt with property disputes before. "Restoration work's gonna run $12,000, Ray said, walking the damaged area and mentally calculating soil removal, grading, and landscaping replacement. That's a lot of destruction for someone claiming to improve drainage. What if I told you this work would be performed in front of the entire neighborhood, city officials, and probably newspaper reporters?" Ray stopped measuring and looked at me with new interest. "You planning some kind of show?" "The kind of show that ends with criminal charges and front-page coverage." "In that case, call it 8,000. I've always wanted to be part of taking down a corrupt official." The audience required more delicate coordination. I drafted invitations that sounded official enough to guarantee attendance. Emergency community meeting. legal resolution of pond project controversy, and property rights discussion. All Willowbrook Estates residents strongly encouraged to attend for important neighborhood developments. Hand-delivered to 43 households, with RSVP requested to create anticipation and ensure maximum turnout. But the real masterwork was assembling official oversight. During my years of legal research, I discovered that Colorado municipalities love public demonstrations of proper permit compliance. It shows taxpayers that city departments actually enforce regulations. Inspector Patricia Reeves agreed to attend as an educational resource to demonstrate proper restoration procedures. Sergeant Williams committed to public safety oversight, which meant having sworn law enforcement present when Brenda inevitably tried to claim authority she didn't legally possess. My secret weapon required more careful negotiation. Jennifer Martinez from the Denver Post's community section specialized in local government corruption, but HOA disputes rarely qualified as newsworthy unless they involve significant criminal activity. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with," I told her during our phone conversation, choosing my words carefully. "This isn't a neighbor dispute over fence heights. This is systematic fraud, forged legal documents, and criminal property destruction by someone who spent 3 years pretending to have government authority. How much documentation do you have?" 3 file boxes, 47 photographs, financial records showing fund misuse, and expert testimony from licensed surveyors and city officials. The typing sounds through the phone told me I'd captured her attention. If this is as solid as you're describing, it could be front-page material. The legal framework was surprisingly straightforward. Colorado's property damage remediation statutes give homeowners absolute authority to restore illegal destruction, even if that restoration involves public demonstrations with heavy machinery. As long as the work met city standards and respected noise ordinances, I could legally operate construction equipment in full view of anyone interested in watching. The trap's elegance lay in its simplicity. Every possible response Brenda could make would expose her to criminal liability in front of official witnesses. If she showed up and defended her pond project, she'd be confessing to criminal trespassing and felony property destruction. If she tried to stop the restoration, she'd be interfering with legal property maintenance. If she claimed HOA authority to halt anything, she'd be committing fraud under false authority, while police officers and newspaper reporters documented every word. And if she avoided the confrontation entirely, I'd present 3 years of criminal evidence to the entire community without any opposition. The timeline required military precision. Ray's excavator would begin restoration work at 10 a.m., 30 minutes before the community meeting started. Residents could watch legal property repair in progress while filing into the community center for the main presentation. Inside, Derek would systematically destroy Brenda's credibility with prosecutorial thoroughness. Fraudulent HOA membership, manufactured legal documents, systematic harassment under false authority, and criminal liability that could send her to federal prison. "What happens if she brings legal representation?" Derek asked during our final coordination call. "Then her lawyer gets to watch his client confess to multiple felonies, while a newspaper photographer captures every moment for tomorrow's front page." The morning air carried that sharp bite of early spring as I surveyed my battle-scarred backyard one final time. In 6 hours, the excavator damage that started this war would be completely erased. Brenda's criminal career would be publicly exposed, and 3 years of systematic harassment would finally end. Time to show an entire neighborhood what happens when you fight back with better evidence and bigger equipment. Brenda's desperation move came at 8:30 a.m., 90 minutes before her world was scheduled to collapse in front of the entire neighborhood. She appeared at my front door with backup, a nervous man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd been dragged out of bed for emergency damage control, and Janet Ferguson, our HOA treasurer, whose expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. The morning air still carried that crisp bite of early spring, but I could smell the desperation radiating from Brenda, like cheap perfume mixed with flop sweat. "Grant, we need to resolve this situation before it escalates beyond reasonable community discussion," Brenda said, her voice carrying rehearsed calm that didn't quite mask the panic underneath. The expensive suit stepped forward, extending a business card with the kind of precision that screamed billable hours. "Ronald Ashford, attorney at law. Ms. Kensington has engaged my services to address this matter through proper legal channels." I examined the card while noting that someone panicked enough to hire Saturday morning legal counsel was someone who finally understood how deep the criminal hole had become. But hiring private representation, instead of using HOA resources, told me everything I needed to know. Brenda knew this wasn't official business. "What kind of resolution are we talking about?" I asked, my voice steady, while my mind cataloged every word for potential courtroom use. Brenda launched into what sounded like a script written by expensive legal advice delivered at dawn. "The HOA is prepared to forgive all property violations and provide full compensation for any damage from the drainage project. We just need your agreement to discontinue activities that might disrupt normal neighborhood operations." She wanted to buy my silence before the community meeting turned her criminal career into front-page news. "Who authorized the HOA to make this offer?" I asked Janet Ferguson directly. The treasurer's face went pale. "The board hasn't actually met to discuss settlement terms, but Brenda has executive authority." "No, she doesn't," I said, savoring 3 years of legal research finally paying dividends. "We'll be clarifying her actual authority level at today's meeting." Ronald Ashford flipped through his notes with growing confusion. "Mr. Thompson, my client is offering fair compensation. Refusing reasonable negotiation could affect future legal proceedings." Poor guy had no idea he was representing someone facing federal fraud charges. Brenda had hired him without explaining that this wasn't a neighborhood spat. It was a criminal conspiracy with prison time attached. "What legal authority does your client have to represent the HOA?" I asked. "She's the elected president with full executive powers." "That's actually in dispute. Today's meeting will address the legitimacy of her claimed position." Brenda's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine hitting jackpot anxiety. "Grant, I'm trying to fix this before it becomes unnecessarily complicated." "You mean before your 3-year crime spree becomes public knowledge?" Janet Ferguson had been fidgeting like someone standing on hot coals, but finally found her voice. "Brenda, did the board actually vote to authorize pond excavation on Grant's property?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a house fire. "Emergency infrastructure provisions allowed immediate action for community safety. Did you get board approval, yes or no?" Janet pressed, her treasurer instincts cutting through legal doublespeak like a scalpel. Silence thick enough to suffocate small animals. "What about hiring lawyers to create historical documents? Did the board approve those expenses?" Ronald Ashford's pen suddenly stopped moving across his legal pad. His client was being questioned about activities he'd apparently never been briefed on, and the answers weren't matching the story he'd been told. "Janet, you're being manipulated by his campaign to undermine legitimate community governance." "I sign every check," Janet interrupted, her voice strengthening with accountant fury. "I never authorize payments for document reproduction or easement research. Where did that money come from?" The settlement meeting was imploding like a controlled demolition, and Brenda's own lawyer was realizing he'd been hired to represent someone who'd been creative with the truth about recent activities. "Perhaps we should postpone until I can review all relevant HOA documents," Ashford said, his professional composure cracking like ice in spring sunshine. That's when Brenda threw her final Hail Mary with the desperation of someone whose back was against the wall, and the wall was on fire. "Grant, if you continue this public attack on my reputation and community standing, I'll be forced to pursue legal action for defamation." I felt my first genuine smile of the morning. "You're threatening to sue me for exposing documented criminal activity, for spreading malicious lies about a legitimately elected official, an official whose election may have been invalid under original covenant requirements?" Her lawyer was scribbling notes frantically, finally understanding he'd walked into a legal disaster without proper information or adequate preparation. "Community meeting starts in 1 hour, I announced, checking my watch with satisfaction. "Feel free to attend and present your defense. Everything will be documented with official witnesses." As they retreated to Brenda's car, I could hear Ronald Ashford asking rapid-fire questions about covenant compliance, board procedures, and the specific basis for her claimed authority. She'd brought a lawyer to intimidate me, but instead gave him front-row seats to witness her contradictions and evasions. The final confrontation was about to begin, and she'd just handed me additional evidence of her desperation. At 9:45 a.m., Ray's excavator rumbled into my backyard like mechanical thunder, announcing the end of Brenda's criminal empire. The John Deere 310 was smaller than the machine Brenda had used for her illegal pawn project, but it sounded twice as powerful. Ray positioned it with surgical precision at the edge of the damaged area, hydraulics hissing like angry serpents as he adjusted the stabilizer legs and prepared to systematically erase every trace of her property destruction. "Remember," I told Ray as he climbed into the operator's seat, "this is a legal demonstration of proper property restoration procedures. Everything by the book, everything documented." "You got it, boss. I've got permits, insurance, and 30 years of experience. If your HOA lady wants to mess with legal excavation work, she can explain herself to my bonding company and the city inspector." The hydraulic whine of the excavator's startup sequence carried across the neighborhood like a mechanical rooster announcing dawn's justice. Within minutes, neighbors started gathering along my fence line to watch what they sensed would be the final act of our 3-year drama. Mrs. Smith appeared with coffee in a thermos and the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. Bob Martinez set up a folding chair, like he was attending an outdoor concert featuring heavy machinery and suburban vindication. Even the teenagers from the end of the block wandered over, drawn by the universal appeal of watching authority figures get their comeuppance with industrial equipment. Ray worked with mechanical ballet, the excavator's bucket scooping out jumbled earth from Brenda's illegal excavation and carefully grading it into neat piles for disposal. Each movement was calculated to restore my property to its original condition, while providing visual proof that proper restoration work looked nothing like the destruction Brenda had authorized. That's when she made her entrance with theatrical timing that would have impressed Broadway directors. Brenda arrived in a sheriff's department patrol car, riding shotgun with Deputy Martinez, while wearing the triumphant expression of someone who believed they'd just played their ace of spades. The cruiser pulled up with official authority, red and blue lights flashing like a mobile Christmas display, creating exactly the kind of dramatic backdrop she'd probably rehearsed in her imagination. "Officer, this is the property destruction I reported," she announced, pointing at Ray's excavator like she'd discovered a criminal enterprise in progress. "He's operating heavy machinery without proper authorization and damaging community infrastructure." Deputy Martinez surveyed the scene with professional skepticism that comes from responding to too many neighbor disputes disguised as emergency calls. The excavator was clearly performing restoration work, not destruction. Ray had proper permits posted on his equipment like a contractor's badge of honor. The gathered neighbors looked more like an interested audience than concerned complainants reporting criminal activity. "Ma'am, what specific violations are you alleging?" "Unauthorized excavation activities on community property without HOA approval." "This is private residential property," Inspector Reeves interrupted, appearing with perfect timing and official city credentials that carried more legal weight than Brenda's clipboard. "The restoration work is fully permitted and legally required to remediate damage from previous unauthorized excavation." Deputy Martinez consulted his notepad with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect he'd been called to witness someone else's legal problems, rather than investigate actual crimes. "When you called this morning, you mentioned restraining order violations. Do you have documentation of any existing court orders?" Brenda's confident expression flickered like a candle in wind. "I'm in the process of filing protective orders based on his threatening behavior, so there's currently no restraining order in effect. Not technically, but his aggressive actions clearly demonstrate." "Ma'am, filing false police reports is a criminal offense. Are you certain you want to proceed with these allegations?" The crowd was growing like a neighborhood block party, organized around watching someone's authority evaporate in real time. More neighbors arrived carrying folders, document boxes, and cameras. Janet Washington brought a 3-ring binder labeled "Brenda's Violation History." The Garcias carried manila envelopes thick with correspondence. Old Mr. Kowalski shuffled over with his shoebox full of bogus citation notices, looking like he was bringing evidence to a trial. Jennifer Martinez from the Denver Post was interviewing Mrs. Smith about her experiences with selective HOA enforcement, while the photographer captured the excavator work, the gathering crowd, and Brenda's increasingly frantic interactions with law enforcement, who were clearly losing patience with her version of events. "This is obviously a coordinated harassment campaign designed to undermine legitimate community governance," Brenda declared to anyone within shouting distance, her voice rising to the pitch reserved for desperate people making final stands. Inspector Reeves finished examining Ray's permit paperwork and restoration specifications with the thoroughness of someone who took municipal regulations seriously. "All excavation activities are in full compliance with city standards," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The restoration work is professionally executed and legally mandated to repair previous unauthorized damage." Brenda played her final card with the desperation of someone whose entire fake authority structure was collapsing in front of official witnesses. "The excavated soil belongs to the HOA," she shouted, pointing at the neat piles of earth Ray had organized for disposal. "That material was removed during an authorized community infrastructure project, which makes it organizational property." The statement was so absurdly desperate that even Deputy Martinez looked embarrassed for her. Ray called down from his excavator with the weathered voice of someone who dealt with every variety of property dispute over 3 decades. "Lady, this is dirt that came from his land. I'm literally putting it back where you illegally took it from. But the excavation was performed under legitimate community improvement authority." "Authority you don't legally possess," I said, finally stepping into the conversation with 3 years of documentation backing every word. "Because you're not actually a member of the HOA." The crowd went silent except for the excavator's idle rumble. Brenda stared at me like someone who'd just been told their winning lottery ticket was counterfeit. "That's impossible. I'm the elected president of an organization you were never eligible to join." The public confrontation was about to reach its climax, and she'd just walked into the legal trap I'd been preparing for months. The community center had never hosted drama this intense since the Great Bake-Off controversy of 2019, and that involved actual fistfights over stolen recipes. 47 residents packed into a space designed for 30, with overflow crowds spilling onto the sidewalk outside, where they could watch Ray's excavator continue its methodical restoration work. The air hummed with nervous energy, and the smell of overbrewed coffee from the ancient percolator that had probably witnessed every neighborhood crisis since the Carter administration. I stood at the front of the room with Derek, our documentation spread across 3 folding tables like a prosecutor's evidence display that would make federal courts jealous. Behind us, a projection screen showed the timeline we'd constructed: 3 years of systematic fraud, harassment, and criminal abuse of imaginary authority. Brenda sat in the front row with Ronald Ashford, who looked like he'd rather be defending serial killers than trying to explain his client's suburban crime spree. Janet Ferguson sat as far from Brenda as physics allowed, while still technically being at the same meeting. "Before we discuss the pond project," I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, "we need to address a fundamental question. Who has legal authority to make decisions for this HOA?" Derek stepped forward with documents that would end Brenda's reign of terror with the precision of a legal scalpel. According to the original Willowbrook Estates covenants adopted in 1985, mandatory HOA membership applies only to properties purchased after the covenant adoption date. Properties purchased before 1985 were grandfathered under the voluntary guidelines system. He held up Brenda's property deed like evidence in a murder trial. Brenda Kensington purchased her home in March 1984. Under the legal framework governing this community, she is not a mandatory HOA member and cannot hold office in the organization. The room erupted like someone had announced that taxes were optional and pizza was free. "Every violation notice she issued was legally meaningless," Derek continued over the crowd noise that sounded like 3 years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. "Every fine she levied was unauthorized extortion. Every emergency power she claimed was complete legal fiction." Inspector Reeves stepped forward with her official city credentials and the kind of bureaucratic authority that makes fake officials everywhere break into cold sweats. "I've reviewed every permit and violation complaint filed by Ms. Kensington over the past 3 years. None were issued by someone with legal standing to represent this HOA." Brenda shot to her feet like someone had applied electricity to her chair, her face flushed with desperate fury. "This is a malicious conspiracy designed to undermine legitimate community governance." "What community governance?" Janet Washington called out from the crowd. "You sent me 17 violation notices for Christmas decorations I removed in January." "You cited me for a barking dog," Miguel Garcia added, his voice carrying 3 years of accumulated frustration. "I'm allergic to dogs." My grass violations were for measurements you invented, old Mr. Kowalski declared, waving his ruler like a weapon of mathematical justice. The floodgates opened like a dam bursting under pressure from years of stored injustice. One by one, neighbors stood up to describe their experiences with Brenda's harassment campaign. Each story followed the same pattern: impossible violations, fabricated complaints, systematic targeting based on demographics rather than actual property issues. Jennifer Martinez's photographer captured everything, the camera flash illuminating faces full of suppressed anger, finally getting its day in court. "These accusations are completely unfounded," Brenda declared, her voice rising to shouting levels that made windows vibrate. "I have followed proper HOA procedures for every enforcement action taken in this community." That's when she made the fatal mistake that would end her criminal career. The pond excavation was fully authorized under emergency infrastructure powers granted by Section 12.3b of the Community Covenants. Deputy Martinez, who'd been taking notes quietly in the back like a professional stenographer, suddenly looked very interested in the conversation. "Ma'am, are you stating that you personally ordered excavation work on private property?" "I authorized necessary drainage improvements for community safety using legitimate emergency management authority." "Using what specific legal standing?" "My authority as the duly elected HOA president." Derek smiled like a chess master who'd just been handed checkmate on a silver platter. "Authority you don't legally possess because you're not an HOA member under the original covenant structure." The confession was complete and witnessed by 47 residents, 2 law enforcement officers, a city inspector, and a newspaper reporter whose photographer was documenting every word for tomorrow's front page. Brenda had just admitted to criminal trespass, felony property destruction, filing fraudulent permits, and systematic harassment while claiming authority she never legally possessed. Her attorney was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how quickly he could withdraw from representation before this disaster destroyed his professional reputation. "I want to file formal criminal charges," I announced, with the satisfaction of someone whose 3-year legal research project was finally paying maximum dividends. "I second that motion," Janet Washington called out. "Third," added Miguel Garcia. The vote was unanimous. 47 residents agreed to pursue criminal charges and civil restitution against Brenda Kensington for systematic abuse of imaginary authority. Inspector Reeves confirmed that filing fraudulent permits carried felony penalties under Colorado law. Deputy Martinez started taking formal statements for criminal investigation. Jennifer Martinez had enough material for a front-page story that would make this the most famous HOA fraud case in state history. Outside, Ray's excavator finished its work with perfect timing, the hydraulic systems powering down with a satisfied mechanical sigh. My property was completely restored, better than it had been before Brenda's illegal pond project. But more importantly, our neighborhood was finally free from 3 years of systematic harassment disguised as community governance. Justice had been served, with heavy machinery, impeccable documentation, and 47 witnesses who would never forget the day suburban tyranny met its match. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates had transformed from a neighborhood under siege into something resembling an actual community where people wanted to live. Brenda Kensington pled guilty to multiple fraud charges in exchange for full restitution to affected homeowners and 200 hours of community service. Ironically, she'd be serving the community she'd spent 3 years terrorizing. She sold her house and moved to Arizona, leaving behind only angry Yelp reviews and a cautionary tale that spread through Colorado HOA circles like wildfire, with a legal education component. The whole thing cost her about $43,000 in restitution payments, Derek told me over coffee at our favorite diner, shuffling through the final legal paperwork that closed the book on our neighborhood nightmare. Plus attorney fees, moving costs, and the loss on her house sale when the Denver Post story made her the most famous HOA criminal in state history. The newspaper coverage had been spectacular, beyond my wildest revenge fantasies. Jennifer Martinez's front-page article, titled "Fake HOA, President's 3-Year Fraud Exposed by Excavator Showdown," became the most shared local news story in the paper's digital history. The photograph of Brenda arguing with police while my excavator worked in the background became a local meme and a cautionary tale used in municipal law enforcement training. But the real victory was what happened to our community after her criminal reign ended. With Brenda gone, the neighborhood held its first legitimate HOA election in years. Janet Ferguson was elected president by unanimous vote, with a clear mandate to create transparent, accountable community governance that actually served residents instead of harassing them. The new HOA's first official act was establishing legal oversight requirements for all future board members, including mandatory background checks and verification of actual membership eligibility. No more fake presidents with imaginary authority. Their second act launched the Willowbrook Community Garden Project on a vacant lot the HOA purchased legitimately, with proper permits and unanimous resident approval. My grandfather's destroyed vegetable garden provided starter plants for the whole neighborhood, turning his legacy into something that fed families instead of generating fake violations. The garden became a symbol of healing and community cooperation. Every Sunday morning, neighbors gathered to tend shared plots, swapping gardening knowledge and stories about their experiences during the Brenda years, a period that had become neighborhood shorthand for bureaucratic insanity. Mrs. Smith's sunflower competition expanded into a community festival that raised money for local food banks. Old Mr. Kowalski, freed from constant harassment about his perfect lawn maintenance, became the garden's unofficial groundskeeper and grass measuring expert. The Garcia family started a successful herb-growing cooperative that supplied 3 local restaurants. Janet Washington organized neighborhood potlucks that actually brought people together instead of serving as evidence-gathering sessions for manufactured violations. The story had broader impact that surprised everyone involved. Colorado's state legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act 8 months after our story went viral, requiring HOA board members to meet basic eligibility requirements and creating criminal penalties for fraud committed under false authority. The law became a model for similar legislation in 12 other states. I started a neighborhood legal aid fund, using my restitution money to help other homeowners facing similar harassment. We've assisted 23 families across the Denver metro area with HOA disputes, property boundary issues, and bogus code enforcement complaints, all using the documentation techniques and legal strategies that brought down Brenda's criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was deeply personal. My backyard, fully restored and enhanced with professional irrigation paid for by Brenda's restitution, became the neighborhood's unofficial gathering place. The oak tree my grandfather planted now shades evening barbecues where neighbors share stories and kids play games that don't involve measuring grass length or citing imaginary violations. Ray, the excavator operator who'd become something of a neighborhood hero, started a landscaping business specializing in property rights restoration. His company motto became legendary in contractor circles: "We fix what shouldn't have been broken." The lessons learned were simple but powerful. Documentation defeats deception. Community action overcomes individual harassment. And sometimes, the best response to petty tyranny is public accountability backed by heavy machinery and better legal research. Most importantly, we proved that real authority comes with real oversight, real transparency, and real consequences for criminal misuse. 3 years of systematic harassment ended with 1 day of perfect justice, and our neighborhood will never be the same.
You know what? There's one small detailing grand story that I can't shake. When the excavator finished restoring the backyard, it powered down right as the community meeting ended. Like the whole universe was waiting for that perfect moment, when Brenda had to face the truth. Grant spent $8,000 on that restoration work. Turns out he didn't pay a dim of it, covered by Brenda's restitutional payments. $43,000 total, including her helping to sell her house and leave Colorado entirely. But what impressed me the most wasn't the money. It was how Grant patiently documented everything for 3 years. Every bogus violation notice, every call to the city, every time Brenda broke the law while pretending to enforce it. And then here's what I want you to think about. He discovered that Brenda bought her house in 1984, before the mandatory HOA was even established. She spent 3 years harassing neighbors with authority she never legally possessed. Here's my question for you. Did you know when your neighborhood's HOA was established? Are you certain the people making decisions actually have the right to make them? Or are you just trusting the paperwork they hand you? Drop a comment and tell me the craziest HOA story you heard, or leave through. And if this story makes you want to check your own rights, hit that like and subscribe. There's one thing I learned from the story like this. The people yelling loudest about the rules are usually the ones breaking them the most.